time for Samir and Alia as well. 3 people who live in London end up in a building in Berlin. What are the odds? Before we get into the talk, today's talk, I just want to kind of touch on some of the context and just kind of remembering the place that where we are right now. I mean, I've been wanting to come here for years, primarily because of what this place symbolises, and for people sitting in the audience here in person, it's probably your day-to-day, but as an outsider, it's so lovely to see how a concrete building can represent so much hope in a wider neighbourhood where just a few steps away, a lot of low-income people from migrant backgrounds, second-generation people like myself, in a different context. So this place provides hope, and I just wanted to open that up and remind people here that we can see that from far off. So much of my career has been a typical journalist, constantly looking for stories, not really caring about the way media has been funded. It's very kind of, the last 10 years prior to working for Alliance magazine, I'd go newsroom to newsroom looking for stories, maybe being kind of a layoff or a redundancy and feeling angry about that and complaining why my contracts were always short term. And essentially I was only really looking under my nose and not connecting the dots of the system. And in a way, what was happening, what I was experiencing at a human level, has been replicated structurally. A newsroom can struggle for many years, and it will either die or a billionaire will co-opt it as his plaything. And obviously in the last week, we found out the world has its first trillionaire, which we won't talk about today, but that is the grand context of so much of this talk. So with that, I'll bring to today's session, and I just want to kind of preempt today's session. First, we'll also have a live stream, so welcome to people around the world. We'll have question and answers at the end, so we'll also be taking that from our virtual audience. I think it's the best place to start with the understanding of journalism and media ecosystem right now, because we know that it's a public good, but the reality is that past systems of media support have not been enough to fix some major failures. We've seen the collapse of aid from wealthy nations. USAID took a lot of the headlines. Cuts from the British and German governments have been slightly hidden from international view, but it's worth saying. But those cuts have exposed a naked truth. The aid cuts didn't break media funding. They just exposed how fragile the system already was. Many already knew this, and by many I mean many people across the global south, or the global majority. I don't know what term to use yet, I'm still figuring it out. And it's with their lens that Alliance magazine kind of brings this session in the Publix building in Berlin today. There are stronger demands across the global south in particular for more resources and more decision-making powers to be put directly in their hands. Those demands were made long before the aid cuts and the shrinking funding landscape. We can no longer ignore those demands. In fact, we may be able to learn from them. And this is the reason why we've convened this session called Reservoirs of Hope. Reservoirs act as open air storage facilities. Water is collected, and through drought periods, they're drawn off. Reservoirs function for communities and for people, but we have to remember they're artificial, they're man-made, and if they're not built well, they can cause real harm. And so that's an apt metaphor and a visual for our panel talk today. Before I introduce my panelists, we have our friends from IFPIM here today. Tidhar would like to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, I'm Tidhar from IFPIM. It's the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which is an international organization that funds media in low and middle income countries. Since our foundation 4 years ago, we've supported over 140 media outlets in 34 countries. And I just want to thank Alliance Magazine for convening this really important talk. And I love the title Reservoirs of Hope, because we have seen hope. In the 4 years that we've supported media, we've seen that many of them are using this funding to innovate, to develop new sources of funding, and the data speaks for itself. Nearly 75% of our grantees have been able to increase their non-grant revenue, and most importantly, the vast majority have also been able to increase the outreach, the audience, and the depth. That's something we'll hear more of the relationship with our audience. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dida. So I'll introduce our panelists. We have Alia Ibrahim, CEO and founder of Lebanese independent media outlet Daraj. They are a previous IFPIM grant recipient, and she'll be bringing perspectives from the Middle East region. Daraj work across Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, across other countries. They use video-first strategy that has translated into remarkable audience growth, both within Lebanese borders and across it. So she'll be touching on that. And Alia also collaborated on the Panama Papers, which is that's a whole other talk. We also have Samir Padania, advisor on policy, practice and funding for independent journalism and information ecosystems around the world. In the UK, he led the Public Interest News Foundation's Media Wealth Building Initiative that has helped to build local news plans across the UK, and the UK's first participatory local news fund. You should dance, Samir, you should. I would personally describe Samir as a scholar, actually, rather than an advisor. He's a wealth of knowledge, a Yoda of public interest media. Pressure, Samir, pressure. He also doesn't mess about, by the way. He did a paper on why the BBC needs radical reform and how citizens should save the BBC. So don't mess with Samir, is what I'm saying. So, I'm going to kick off. Sorry, I actually forgot. We also have another panelist. She's not in the room. We can't forget her. Carolina Oms of the Brazilian Journalism Fund. Carolina couldn't make it. Obviously, she's in Brazil. She's actually also giving birth right now, as we speak. So we have a pre-recorded clips from Carolina from last week. I hope she doesn't mind me saying. It was from a hospital hotel room, which was amazing. Carolina is watching. Please don't watch this. Please don't watch this. Go away. So, we're going to kick things off. Firstly, talking about reimagining and what that actually means. We're going to go to the national pooled funds and what they actually are. They've emerged with popularity, force and conviction over the last 2-3 years. They predated the withdrawal of USAID and other aid funding. Philanthropy has typically chosen winners and losers. These funds are doing something different. Samir, it's quite a sweet idea, given the world we live in, of billionaire capture, big tech acting like cowboys. Can you just take us through what they actually are? Because in 2023, you actually published a report for Global Forum for Media Development outlining the fundamentals of national journalism funds.
Is this on? Yes. Funds there must be. I don't know, I'm supposed to be Yoda now. I think it's important to just expand a little bit on the context that you're talking about. So global north countries are experiencing the kinds of things that people in the global majority have experienced for decades or longer. And I think that that's been one of the most interesting things to watch in the past sort of 5 to 10 years. You know, what has the reaction been, and what of the structures that exist in the north kind of, how have they reacted? So, you know, we'll come back to that, but in a sense, I think what we're dealing with is increased populism, instability, withdrawal of funding, increased capture of media ecosystems, seemingly limitless funds available for certain kinds of things and almost no funds available for anything in the public interest. It's not just journalism, it's things related to rule of law, legal aid, anything that's to sort of reduce inequality seems to be too expensive, and anything that seems to entrench or increase it is really investable. So I think that sort of broad context, alongside a kind of feeling of deliberate polarization, attempting to undermine the bonds of trust, expectation of what the common interest in a society is, people trying to weaponize communication, media, technologies, to try and undermine those things. That's the broader context which we all, to some degree or another, are living. Not just at a national level, but also increasingly at the local level. So that's a pretty sort of rough environment in which to see declining funding for media, declining advertising revenues, declining ability for media to make money in the ways that they used to. And I think that was the sort of environment into which we put this report about national funds, because in a sense what people were complaining about for a long time was there isn't enough philanthropy, there isn't enough investment money, philanthropy isn't consistent, so there are very few journalism focused philanthropies. The ones that are focused on this are overstretched, and the demand is growing and growing, and that the strategies that they have, and I'm talking over a long period of time. I worked, 10 years ago, I left Open Society, having been a grant maker there, and I've worked with a bunch of different foundations and initiatives in the years since. And it's a small group. It is unfortunately still a small group. There are many more that care about overlapping issues like democracy or whatever it might be. But the ones who understand the needs of the journalism ecosystem are bounded by the need to renew and refresh their strategy, the fact that kind of resources come and go, they can only prioritize a certain amount, and particularly when they're working internationally, it's very, very difficult for them to balance their expenditure. How do you choose whether to work in Nigeria, Ghana, Peru, etc.? All of that strategic work that was there for many, many years, where there was a lot of funding available across the global south, particularly, that was also balanced by government funding. Government funding's been reduced, so philanthropies had to step back. So, in that context, we felt that talking to a lot of different people about the kinds of structures that they would like to see, and what they think would not necessarily solve the funding crisis, but that would begin to push back on and spread the risk in the funding environment, was the creation of funds closer to them, designed by them, and funded and staffed by people from that country, that region, whatever it might be, and designed according to the priorities of those different media markets, national contexts, even local contexts. So that was the broad principle of where the idea for a new wave of national funds came from. Initially, there was some resistance because there have been examples of national funds in lots of different places. Many of them have suffered from issues of poor design or poor governance, or being co-opted or captured, or not being capitalized for long enough to be able to last and to sort of endure for long enough. They ended up being effectively kind of projects of governments or philanthropies or whatever it might be. So I think there was an opportunity in the shrinking international environment of funding to rethink what those institutions might be and what they might look like. And what has happened, alongside that, is that in the global north, and one of the theses we had was that it was getting harder and harder for funders in the global north, both governmental and in some cases philanthropic, to resist the sort of populist urges domestically. So they're being pushed in a way where, funding is under more scrutiny, the pressure not to fund internationally, the need to fund domestically, was greater and greater, and that was putting more and more pressure on Global South colleagues who had in the past been reliant or had depended for a portion of their funding on Global North funding. And so as part of that, they were saying, we can see the way that politically the Global North is going. You should move money now to the Global South, and you should put it in places where we can control and influence that to our own agendas and our own priorities. So that was the sort of initial, if you like, the context and the framing for how a lot of that policy work came from.
We'll dig into what independence and autonomy looks like structurally later on in the talk. Before I go to Alia, I'll introduce the Brazilian Journalism Fund as our third panellist. They were first conceived in 2022, bringing journalism, civil society, and philanthropy together. They're a unique or very interesting case. The fund is an intermediary, doesn't fund editorial projects. It's a purely core support mechanism. And it was made in response to some extraordinary challenges in Brazil. There are some extraordinary eye-opening stats about the media landscape there. 50 of the country's leading media outlets are controlled by just 26 groups. They're mostly powerful families. And media in Brazil are often relied on one-off support. There are 26.7 million people without access to any quality information. And this one is staggering in the philanthropic stats. In 2023, only 10 foundations invested $16 million across 81 independent media organizations. You can see how thin that investment is. And actually, prior to 22-23, there's no philanthropic data in Brazil. So I asked Carolina where the pressure for the Brazilian Journalism Fund came from, and we'll play her response.
I think it came from the field, reaching out to philanthropies daily, monthly. As journalists are so well in doing so, we are very good at nagging and knocking on doors and finding a way to reach people. And so they found philanthropy. And they started to asking, why not us? Look at the great job we're doing. We could use some help as well. And what are the criteria for philanthropic money? Where do you want to go? Why can't we be a part of that as well? And especially always making an effort to point out how much the money distribution was centered in the richer region of Brazil, which is the southeast, where there is São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. And slowly, as usual, philanthropy began to answer to that. But it's not possible for a major philanthropy to reach all of the regions of Brazil with quality because of the amazing capillarity and the size of our country and the diversity of our media. So they started making sense of a creation of a fund. There were talks about funds being created in other areas, not only journalists. And we had a couple years before, those digital medias that have created the Association of Digital Independent Media, which is called AJOR. And this association kind of concentrated some of the discussions about the creation of this fund. What should it be? What should it address? How much money would it have? And at the beginning, none of that was known. It was all discussed as things progressed. But also, this is also a result, before that, this is also a result of the creation of those independent digital medias and they're thriving in this environment because Brazil has a big, amazing, innovative digital media ecosystem, and it began to make some noise around the country. It began to, a month ago, independent media changed the course of our elections this year. A year before, this keeps happening, major breakthroughs, major plot twists performed by the independency of these new media outlets who were created during this digital outburst that we have been testimony of. However, I do have to say that the environment where those organizations were created does not exist anymore, because 10 years ago platforms were less censored, were less opaque, and journalistic content could circulate a lot more freely than it does today. So even though this environment, the organizations that came through, they still exist, they are still struggling to exist. The environment that where they were created does not exist anymore. And I think besides fighting for funding, we are all fighting for distribution and platformization and more equality on how information flows all over the world and also in Brazil. Because as you said, we do have a very concentrated media environment, and once digital platforms came in and they were trying to reach in new users, there was a glimpse of a more democratic way of information fluxes to circulate. But this glimpse is now over, and so right now I would say that besides the news deserts, besides the money concentration, besides the huge oligopolies that traditional media has in Brazil, we are also facing the challenge of funding for this innovative outlets, independent, and also facing the challenge of reaching the audience. And this connects, of course, directly with sustainability, because if you can't reach your audience, how will you be sustainable? So this is, I think, the scenario that we are. But 2 years ago, I think it was beginning. Now I think 2 years later, it got a little bit worse. But I also do think that even though it got worse, we are more aware of the challenges that we have.
And arguably, you're saying the environment has changed rapidly in 10 years. There's an argument to be had that philanthropy, by contrast, so we're talking big philanthropy here, international donors, have not changed, generally speaking.
No, I think they have changed, but not to respond to those challenges. They have changed in a way to say, well, we've tried journalists for a couple of years and it's got harder. It's very political. Journalists are people that usually they will be the ones poking on rich people and their fortunes. So of course, and this is where the money from major philanthropies come from in many cases, and fiscal renounces, of course. But so I do think that this movement I'm not sure each philanthropy has its own reasons to walk away from journalism. On the record, they will say that the business model did not came through, that the the journalists are not concerned enough with the audiences and distribution, which this is not the reality I see here in Brazil. I see people really concerned about that. There is an understanding that some of those causes might be a market failure, in the sense that they will never reach a point of enough sustainability to walk alone without other supports. But they still choose they are still supported because they are considered a public good. They're considered of public interest, which is the case of what we think about journalism. Journalism is a public good. And this does not mean that I think that every single news organization needs philanthropic or government support. Of course, journalism is very diverse, thankfully, still, and the business model and the solutions for business and for sustainability are huge. But in some cases, like maybe investigative journalism or really niched audiences, maybe there are some cases for support necessary. And well, there wasn't enough time also for organizations to make themselves a new business model in this changing environment. So if you just say, well, philanthropy is leaving journalism because it did not work in terms of models, how much time was it given? How much communication was it given, really? Because last week we had news of the first independent digital media that closed, or they announced a break due to money reasons, and in their in their statement, they said, well, we have had funding for 2 years, and after that, funding is just over. They are a for-profit, but they have their principles, and they want to be a business that contributes to democracy as well. They're focused on technology. And they said, well, we had 2-3 years max to make this work. If you are a startup working on a changing environment like Uber, like many of the unicorns that we have so far, it was not enough time for us to arrange a new model, like 2 years, 3 years, like from zero to some money. It's not enough. So there is also the case that it was too little money for too little time, and I don't think also the organizations knew quite much ahead how much would be taken away one after another. Like 2023 from 2024, like there was a huge drop, and then 2025 another huge drop. So we're seeing the media organizations, at least here in Brazil, really struggling and not sure what they did wrong and what will come next.
There is so much uncertainty, and obviously.
So that's quite a chunky one there from Carolina. And there's a lot to pick up on, so I'm just going to pause it there for a second. I'm going to come to Alia. We'll pick up some of the points that Carolina said, but firstly, we're going to come to you because you also work in a high-pressured environment in Lebanon, where the competition has been fierce, also in the wider region of the Middle East, where arguably independent media have been fighting over puddles of funding, sandwiched in between international aid and perhaps some spurious political actors. You have done something very different. Rather than asking for money for certain editorial projects, you're building out new revenue streams instead of waiting for the next grant cycle. Can you explain the approach that you took and why, how Balash has taken a commercial route with philanthropic funding?
Thank you, Shafi. I'll have to go back a little bit in time to explain the context within which we created Garage. And I want to comment very quickly on what you said about being back to Berlin. In my mind, it was 5 years ago, and then I did the math. It was 20 years ago when I first came to Berlin. And I remember I was covering an election, and for me as an Arab journalist at the time, it felt what an amazing city because it gave me a sense of possible. It was like, I used the term at the time, an accessible Europe. You could see how things could change and countries can reimagine their futures. I was at the time working for between the Daily Star and the Washington Post and moving to changing audiences. I moved to Al Arabiya because I wanted to address my audience in my own language. So I left print and English to do Arabic and TV. And 2011 happened. The Arab Spring was a moment of incredible hope in the region. And as a roving correspondent at the time, I covered all the Arab Springs. I've been to Yemen, I've been to Libya, I've been to Syria, covered the protests across Egypt, and it was incredible moment of hope. But even as a journalist, as much as I loved what I was seeing, and as hopeful as I am by nature, you could see that even toppling a regime, if there is no infrastructure to what comes later, and there was nothing. There was no civil society, there was some journalism, but it was really very young and very unstructured. The journalism that I was part of, which was what existed, it's fully owned by government, not 25, not 35. It's 100% owned by political money. I was working for Al Arabiya, which is owned by a private businessman, but at the end of the day, it is the Saudi. It's a Saudi organization. My two co-founders also worked for Al Sharq Al Awsat and Al Hayat. One of them was the director of the investigative journalism for Al Hayat, and one was the editor of the opinion at Al Sharq Al Awsat. To say that both of us were in editorial positions in Saudi-owned media. 2016, that was the war in Yemen, and for the three of us, it was never a great place to work. It was not an incredible free newsroom, but to be perfectly, like, we were okay doing the work we did. For me, at Arabia, the only place I couldn't touch was Saudi, but there was nothing happening in Saudi anyway, so I did not really care. But then the war in Yemen happened, and it became impossible to stay there. You mentioned the Panama paper. Actually, the Panama paper was the main reason, next to the war of Yemen, why we had to leave. The Panama paper, we were contacted as journalists to publish the findings of the Panama papers, and it had a big Arab element, because there was the Syrian, the nephew of Rami Makhlouf at the time, a big businessman, the cousin of Bashar al-Assad. It was a huge story, but none of our media organization would even publish the findings. This was like, it was becoming, for us it was like, where do you go from there? If you're working already at the biggest newsrooms in the region, Al Jazeera for me was impossible because it was too Islamist to my taste. So I really did not have a place to go, neither did my co-founders. So we decided, let's do our own media, a media company owned by the journalists. And it's so funny, Samir, what you were saying. We were looking, I worked at the Washington Post. I did not consider it an incredibly, like, it had its own share of problems, but it was a completely different reality in terms of the journalism that you could do as a journalist working for this organization. So we looked west, and we were looking like, there is, even if as imperfect as it is, there is something to aspire to do as journalists. So we created Daraj, which, by the way, means stairway. It's like we were in a deep hole and we wanted to get out of it one step at a time. We created Daraj, and it was supposed to be funded by investors. And that's why I took a whole year. I'm somebody who did not do her expenses sheet, and I would refuse to talk money to anybody because I'm doing the important job. And I had to spend a whole year speaking to our investors. They wanted to have a CEO. And unless one of the three of us accepted to be CEO, it was going to be a business person. So my co-founder, the editor, was there for 5 minutes. He said, I'm not doing this. So it had to be me. And I had to do the CEO part for a whole year. So we studied the business model for Daraj. And to make a long story short, the idea was, we would do what our investors wanted, which is commercially driven content. In Arabic, it made a lot of sense because we're 6% of the internet population and only 1% of the content available. And what exists is really bad. So there was room for content that could have financial, viable commercial value. Our condition that was, we also create the investigative journalism, which is signature content that will never make money because investigative journalism doesn't make money. That was the business model. Our investors loved the commercial part, but said, you can't do the investigative journalism, and if you do, no one would be interested, so forget about it. We walked out at the door and we left it open. We said, we come back in 5 years and we speak, let us go and do speaking their language, let's have a proof of concept. And this is when, honestly, we were three mid-career journalists. We could not start without core funding. So, and this is where we were introduced at the beginning to IMS and eventually our other core funding, but we could not even launch Daraj on projects. That's
this was
why
2016.
I took a whole year in research. We launched on November 5, 2017. 5 days after the Paradise Papers. Initially, we contacted ICIJ. We said, if we create our own organizations, will you let us work on the next investigation? They said, it's perfect, because now is the next investigation. And when we launched, we didn't even have, we have to rent a space online to launch, because we published November 1st and published the Paradise Papers on November 5th. And that's why from day one, Daraj, it's like our brand as investigative journalism was very well positioned. We also do underreported demographics. So these are holding power into account and covering underreported demographics. We do a lot of gender and refugees. these are like our fortes. But to make a long story short, we never stopped looking at, we registered Daraj as a for-profit company, and the research I took a year doing, it was very built in our mind to be really independent. We really needed to make our own money. And given the time I spent studying our audience, it's feasible, but it requires some kind of investments. But very early on, in 2019, we started looking at the sustainability model. But the idea is how we started. For us, we looked at Daraj would not be Daraj if we did not have the support of our donors from the beginning, who invested in us as core funding. As I mentioned, we could not be project-based. We were, even if, I say it as it is, but even if I accepted to get 50% of my previous salary, I still needed 50% of a salary. I could not volunteer. I had volunteered a year to research, but you can't volunteer for year after year after year. So we were very confident in the kind of journalism we could build. We were very confident about the demand. The first year when you were in research, Daraj happened and had a very good proof of concept right from the beginning, because every journalist we're 3 journalists in 3 big organizations, so our network is really big. There's not one journalist we asked to help us with the pilot stage who did not say, please, thank you for doing this, and volunteer their own work. So the first few months it was all volunteering, but then this is not sustainable in the long term. In the long term, people would support you once, twice, etc. But then you need to build it in a different way. I can't believe it's been almost 10 years since.
And in 2023, you received an IFPIM grant that would last over 3 years to test out the viability of your revenue stream. And you said something to me in our previous talks about getting people to go beyond their perception of survival, of competitiveness in kind of the wider landscape. But is that, for you, was that grant cultural change as well, as much as a financial impetus?
Well, I'm going to say my favorite sentence, even if sometimes it's misunderstood. In 2023, we received the IFPIM grant, and what I loved about this grant is that it had to be, it was about experimenting our revenue streams. If I go back in time, since 2019, we created something called AIM. It's Alliance of Independent Media. And my idea at the time was that instead of competing together over grants money, we can build an alliance and go after advertisement money. That was one of the revenue streams I wanted to test, but it was all theoretical. What the IFPIM grant allowed over two years is to really test the revenue streams. And when I say we tested, it means there's nothing theoretical about it. We really went all in the market to study 4 revenue streams: audience monetization, network monetization, production, and advertisement. These are all areas at small, like we could see that where we could make some money working on. 2.5 years later, we have, again, I find in myself the confidence to say the sentence of my biggest finding is that charity and sustainability should not sit in the same sentence. The reason I say that, Daraj would not exist without core funding. It would not exist without donors' money. And for us as journalists, if we hadn't created Daraj, we really had no place to go. Like, I don't want to make, I know everyone here knows the idea what impact journalism and what public interest journalism is. In the Arab context, there is not even a public service you can trust. It's really, I don't want to make the case for that. But even with this, if we needed the grant funding and the core funding to exist. But if we're going to be sustainable, which is a term we hear a lot, like look at your own sustainability. Carolina also said that you cannot. What I have researched and found for sure is that to grow you need infrastructure. The 3 infrastructure, and I can go into the details of the different revenue streams. But if if you have the most amazing content. Sometimes we do investigative journalism. In Lebanon, we took down our central bank governor. It does not get better than this. But my audience, the audience I'm interested in, is one single person. In our case, it was like for a while, it was the public prosecutor in France who was coming after him. I wish it could be a public prosecutor in Lebanon, but the judiciary is very compromised. But to make a very long story short, sometimes you sit 4 years to work on a story and your audience is one single person with undeniable impact. Undeniable impact. If I have the most amazing journalism, but I don't have the capacity to retell my story in 1600 ways these days to reach my fantastic potential audience anyway, I'm not going far. If I don't have the technology infrastructure to distribute, I'm not going far. If I don't have a marketing team to resell my newsletters and create like all kinds of products, I'm not going far on sustainability. So when I say we all the 4 revenue streams we tested, they all worked, including pitching Netflix a documentary and getting development money from Netflix. But we cannot do it at scale and make it sustainable as a business if we don't have, I was the business development and the marketing team and the everything. Which again, it's because I had the time and the capacity to just to give you examples. When you're working commercially, you have to make quick decisions. You can't wait for the Netflix documentary. I had to fly super quickly to Dubai to see the main person. You take the decision in 3 minutes. You book a ticket, you go. It's not like you have. If you're going to make money, you need to invest money. That's the bottom line. You cannot go far without the tech, without the marketing, and without the legal structures. This is where we are. If I did not have the time, as was mentioned, to what we call failure in our ecosystem is R&D in research and development in startup world. So I think there is something, again, prior to 2023, I was doing every research possible to look at my... Theoretically, I had an idea what needed to be done. I couldn't say it with this confidence had I not really tested it, had I not given it the time and actually going and meeting people and interviewing people and doing the pilot projects and doing a proof of concept. When I say we're ready for the transition, not to go directly to scale because, again, it will be too much money to spend in one place, but to know where the investments need to be done, where and how to go about it.
You've been really busy. I want to touch on some parts of what Carolina has said. When I asked her about whether philanthropy has changed or evolved at the same speed as technology, journalism and media, and whether there's an argument to be said that big philanthropy has not changed at the same rate. And she touched on the point of market failures, and I just wanted to know your view firstly about whether philanthropy has changed at all in the last decade in the same rate as journalism and media has changed, and secondly, whether national funds are a response to market failures.
On philanthropy, it's very difficult to generalize in a way that is useful, particularly to a very educated alliance audience. But what I would observe is that I think more and more of the philanthropic field at different levels, from the sort of big philanthropies that work internationally, particularly US ones and some of the European ones, down to even community foundations, working in localities, both here in Germany and across other parts of Europe, are more and more aware that the internet, media, content, platforms, these are not things that happen sort of over there that an intern takes care of periodically. Which used to be the caricature, but now I think they're understanding this is a fundamental structural condition under which we all work. It affects all of your programmatic areas. The quality of information affects what you're able to do. It affects the ability to do things, whether you care about women's rights or LGBTQ, or you care about the environment, or you care about access to justice, or whatever it might be. Every single one of those areas depends on the quality of information. And that's the sort of condition that, you know, in many global North societies, they weren't expecting to see that eroded so quickly. I think that was the thing that philanthropies, I think, have been surprised by. I would say blindsided by to some degree. You know, and just sort of saying, well, we must fund journalism is part of the picture, but I think what they're metabolizing now is that actually the whole information ecosystem, the whole market, is not failing, it's being captured. So I think it's not that, oh, there's a market. Again, I think this assumption that the market is a sort of neutral kind of, you know, 18th, 19th century notion that it just sort of happens and it's a natural phenomenon, I think has been exposed as being naive at best and a sort of fiction that people have taken advantage of. So the fact that, you know, I would sort of push back slightly on the idea that it's a market failure, and I would say that it's a market capture. And I think that when you look at how the platforms have been allowed to co-opt and capture the information space generally, and have not been, you know, this isn't the place to talk about regulation, but I think, you know, there hasn't been enough recognition of those conditions under which journalism and media are working. I think in that context, if you're saying, well, the market is kind of stacked against independent journalism and independent information, then that means that the way in which you approach how you fund needs to change. You can't do project-based funding as a primary instrument. You must do core funding as a basic condition of what you're, you know, for all the reasons that Alia has just outlined. Journalism takes time, it is uncertain, it requires sort of human power to be able to do it. It requires technology, infrastructure, legal support. It requires, you know, accountants and, you know, all sorts of different...
That wasn't me, someone's coming.
Someone's coming. They've even infiltrated the microphone. So I think that you know, that sort of infrastructure, which I think there is more and more appreciation amongst the broader and broader set of funders that is the case. I think what that means for the way in which we fund, I think we are beginning to catch up, or at least have more structural approaches, and I think that involves not just philanthropic funders, not just social investors, not just development banks and other kinds of financial actors. I think, you know, banks and, you know, not just development banks, I mean actually retail banks and other kinds of people who are sort of invested in quality information, quality data, transparency, the ability to trade freely and all these different things. You know, many sectors are affected by the quality of information. So I think that's a sort of bedrock change that more and more people are understanding. And for that you need types of funding that are specifically focused on the needs of that sector, you know, which is why we then focus on journalism funds. You know, here we have the Media Forward Fund, which covers the DACH region. You know, you've got structures in a number of different places, and Carolina leads or co-leads one of them in Brazil, but there are, you know, similar structures in other places where people recognize that, look, you know, individual philanthropies have done an extraordinary job of trying to strengthen through their grants programs. But they change strategies, they change leadership, they change taste. They sometimes work in concert, but they don't always. They can't commit to things for 10, 20 years necessarily. They're going to maybe commit for 3 years, 5 years if you're very lucky. So we need other kinds of institutions that endure, not for one programmatic cycle, not for an electoral cycle, but for generations. You need permanent institutions that will fund something that is, as you're saying, a public good. And so I think that's been, the next layer of what's happening in the funding environment. You know, funds that, you know, you may be familiar with Sierra Leone, there's Taiwan, there's, you know, one that's being discussed in Mongolia. There are ones in various different countries that are being sort of set up. And I think that is a positive step. I think the challenge is to have alongside that other kinds of structures. So you have to have the media sector itself coming together, collaborating and understanding, as you're talking about with AIM, for example, there is money on the table in the advertising sector. But the only way that the advertising sector will deal with independent media is if they can show sufficient scale and aggregate audiences. So you need to build the means to do that. And you need a number of different approaches like that begin to, we're talking about what is an economic sector. The organizations in this building represent an economic sector. They employ people, they pay taxes, they are in aggregate supporting or working in a sector that is fundamental to the economy, but we don't often express it that way. We express it as a public good. So you've got these different aspects that I think need to be brought out more aggressively by the independent sector, the local sector, and it needs philanthropic help to do that, but it's not dependent on philanthropic sort of support in the long term. I think this is one of the things that we have to metabolize, really, as a sector, and as a sector I mean including the philanthropies and social investors and high net worth individuals and everybody. I think this is really key, that it's a collective effort by all parts of the sector. It's not donors, funders giving money and then the journalists go off and do work. This is an economic sector which is fundamental to the proper functioning of a society, of democracy, and it's not right to let it purely be determined under market conditions, because the market will not support it, the market will actually crush it if it can. A couple of, we can come to sort of, I think, specific strategies that I think would sit alongside funds, but I think, that to me is a sort of foundational principle for why we do this. From IFPIM at the international level to Civitates and Limelight and others working at sort of across Europe, down to the very, very local level, including the sort of tiny little fund in Uri that in Northern Ireland that I helped to set up.
You've been everywhere, Samir, honestly. You take us from Mongolia to Northern Ireland. I did not expect that at all. There's so much to pick up on, and I think one thing we need to think about is design as part of the reimagining process. So when Alia describes how Daraj approached funders, or how Samir talks about national funds, there is a sense of ownership, essentially, of being accountable to oneself and your counterparts in the design process. In Brazil, they did something really interesting. In 2024, the fund used local consultants, but those consultants were essentially people who lived in Brazil, who worked in Brazil's civil society and journalism sector. And they conducted a participatory kind of research process that resulted in a detailed governance proposal, a 3-year financial plan, structured analysis. I asked Carolina what she thought about funders and whether financial gatekeepers should actively be involved in the design process. We're going to fast forward it to what she talks about the design process.
This is something that philanthropy is quite peculiar in the sense that 2 years is long term. Like in a business, 2 years is not long term. 2 years is the beginning.
Apologies, that's an answer to another question. We'll pause it at that and I'll read out her answer. So essentially, Carolina says that it's a problem if philanthropy centralizes power. And what the fund does in Brazil is actually, by its governance, by the people it supports, the grantees, and the lack of dependence on one single funder, it creates independence and autonomy. And in essence, it involves civil society. And Alia, I'm really interested to hear your view about whether civil society in Lebanon and the wider Middle East can play a transformative part in independent media funding, or is that too far of a stretch?
Well, the short answer to that is it can, but the problem is that if we do it without the proper legal structures, and you're talking about the country where the judiciary does not exist, okay, like it's a serious problem. You cannot count on local laws to do things for you. You really are building from scratch. And it happened last summer. We had a huge budget gap, and we were at the same time under a huge attack by the banking sector, which funds all our mainstream media. So we were like, it was great publicity because we really became a household name overnight. But at the same time, we were being accused of being responsible for the economic collapse in Lebanon. For background, 1 million depositors in Lebanon lost their savings in the banks because of an unofficial and illegal capital control that we covered extensively. So we had 15 lawsuits against us. We had mainstream media attacking us.
Are you still fighting those lawsuits? By the way?
Yeah, but it's okay because the valuation of the money, it's not huge money, but it wastes our time. Like, there is a lot of time we need to go just following up on those lawsuits. Mainstream media making it their job to attack us all day long, and the only place we could go to for like support was civil society that we are part of. You're talking about lawyers, you're talking about all kind of organizing. We're all too small, but the civil society we were part of was very supportive morally. We also got some funding to create, like, the idea was we wanted to create a TV program to answer that. So we had to go create an independent company because we can't take private money from private Lebanese businessmen. We don't know when we will be investigating them. So, you know, the thing is, it's in the Arab world, there's a lot of people who show interest in supporting us. We tell them, we don't even have a membership program to receive their funding. So, you know, the long story is that even to get that support, if you don't have the proper foundations to receive it cleanly in a very transparent way that protects you and protects and keeps the journalism that you created very safe, we can't do it. I would not take any Lebanese businessman money for Daraj. And when I was fundraising for the TV program, we took some money from Lebanese philanthropies. And when they said they're not philanthropies, they're like, in the Lebanese context, they're rich business people who say they have an interest in seeing good judiciary in Lebanon because it's good for their business. But when they said, is Daraj too good for our money? And I told them, are you too good for our money? And I said, I'm okay, I'm taking the money, but Daraj is too good for your money. I would not take money from rich Lebanese into our accounts. We really need that buffer. We need to create that. But if I go and I created this company, to give you just like a very simple example, the full company is registered in my name. I mean, I can do that with one project, with one thing. But I want to hold myself accountable. I want to know that I'm building a proper structure that can live beyond me also without people. What if I die and there is this thing and no one there to fill in the blank? So, you know, what I'm saying is the opportunity is there. But if you don't build the legal infrastructure that protects what we have built over the last 15 years, we compromise it all. This is what I mean. But I want to comment a little bit on what Samir was saying. When I went to Dubai to look at the advertising market in 2019 was $7 billion in the Arab world. Now it's $11 billion. All the grant money that all civil society in my region is 150 million. We're all competing over 150 million. Whereas if we come together, we would have an opportunity to take 1% of those 11 billion, and it would still be a good place. The thing is, all my meetings in Dubai with everybody in the industry, the bottom line of it, you need an audience of 20 million. And AIM represents 13 brands. The information I have is that between us we're at 3 million, assuming with the others. I lied, I said we have 10 million. But 10 million does not give you a seat on the table. To have a seat on the table, you need 20 million. And to build an audience of 20 million, you cannot do it overnight, one. And even if you have like all the money in the world and a trillionaire now in your back giving you all the money, even if you can do it quickly, you still need an infrastructure to do it. But I also wanted to give a little bit, if that's okay with you, what you said on the impact means from a newsroom perspective, on the topics that you mentioned, among the things that we also tested. LGBT, for example, was the most difficult topic for us to cover. It's like every time, and you know, when we were attacked on the banking sector, they could not attack us on that point, so they started saying this organization that is all about promoting homosexuality in the Arab world. It was like, yeah, unbelievable. Like the attacks, they would not attack you politically. They would attack you on like how you compromise. It's the classic book everywhere in the world. So what we did, one of the tests we did is that we worked with a marketing company. We had one of our best researchers work on a 40,000 words piece of literature, the history of homosexuality in the Arab world, which is, the biggest argument is that we're importing problems and the values of the West. The literature on homosexuality in the Arab world dates way before it became a thing it's literally pre-Islam, and it existed all the time. So we had all this research, 40,000 words, that we gave to a marketing company to reframe them in 4 videos, 250 words each. And at the end, it was the first time, that was like 3 years ago, but it was the first time when we published those videos, not only we did not lose audience, not only that we had a conversation on our timelines. People were actually informed. It was very factual, but it was also not 40,000 words that we put on our website. It was a video, and the amount of time, I think I stopped counting at 25, the amount of time the scripts got written and rewritten and rewritten. This is the kind of time and money and resources. You do it one time because we were testing, it was a pilot. But to tell you, the other thing on misinformation in Syria, we have noticed that this is not only about people getting information. Every time there has been violence against minorities in Syria over the last year, it has always started online. Always, every time. Sometimes there was something real happening online, sometimes it was nothing. Like 7 people died because an actor who played the role of Bashar al-Assad in a soap opera came to his hometown, and it was said that he came to the hometown, and it got the rumor 7 people got killed. Let alone what happens with the Druze or with the Christians or with the Alawite. Every time it was misinformation. If we started working on quickly debunking and quickly publishing, you imagine, like for us, we are very much politically, we are very much against political Islam, but for us, even right now, because what we publish is factual, we are looking like the good guys for the regime in Syria. Because we don't exaggerate. When there is a massacre, we say this is the massacre, this is what we know, this is the amount of people who really died, but it's factual information, and it looks very conservative to what is out there. Just to give you an example, it's not only about, as important as it is to protect rights of gender rights, and it's also geopolitics. It's also and it's moving super quickly. The other last example I will give on environment. When we do fantastic investigations on what's happening at the water level, because it's not only the environment. For us, it's very geopolitical. And a few hundred people would read an investigation, whereas we started working with our other partners who are younger, who have younger teams and can produce at much lesser cost than us. And they turned our investigations in Yemen and in Amman, in Jordan and in Syria to content used by younger people. They take the same content, we told them, do whatever you want with it. Like, just use this content and create formats around it. And it has shown us that if you give the audience, you don't have to compromise on the quality. What we're paying for initially, the first product we're creating, the very expensive journalism, now we have the opportunity to repackage it and redistribute it. But again, you need to relook at where the investment is done. No one till now in the philanthropy level wants to invest in what doesn't have a return on investment, if I may call it that, or impact that is measurable in very traditional ways of measuring impact. And that doesn't happen in 2 years or in 3. This is something infrastructural that requires time to be built and also to show how it's paying off. I'm sorry I took too long.
You invited that, by the way.
I think so much of what you're talking about is creating an enabling environment that requires consensus. Samir, you were involved in an early draft, let's put it, for an Arab fund for independent media, kind of prototype. That hasn't been launched, but was that a result of no consensus? Or maybe there was consensus, but that wasn't enough? What happened? If you're allowed to.
It's not about whether allowed or not. It's more that I think that, what do you draw out of examples where, a lot of things are attempted, a lot of things are probed, and, you try initiatives and people will fund things. And just like in the journalism space, you need room to try things out, de-risk and work out what's the space in which you need collaboration in order to create a fund in a particular region. There's a regional fund there are a number of different kinds of regional funds in Europe, and the theory was, is it possible to do this in the Swana region, right? Where there are some conditions that allow, there are international funders who want to fund in this region. There are, from what we understood, people within the region who would like to give money into funds for progressive causes related to journalism and so on. And we know that the funds have been, one, not adequate to meet the need of the whole region, and two, unevenly spread, right? So there are some parts of the Swana region that have received more money than others. There are types of media that have received more money for a short period and then it's gone away, and various different intentions have sort of gone into how that region has received money for journalism. And through, sometimes it's directly from funders, sometimes it's through intermediary organizations, many of them based in Europe. Very rarely has it been under the control of people in the region. So I think that's where the starting point was. And we spoke to many, many people, dozens and dozens of different people in different parts of the sector, funders internationally, locally, journalism organizations, individuals working in other kinds of funds in the region. And really the outcome was that there is in fact a lot of consensus around the dynamics and the need to go forward. What brought that to a sort of pause was really the US aid cuts, because then the reprioritization of what organizations themselves wanted to do, then it became, well, actually, right now we have an existential crisis that, somebody's tried to pull the rug from under our feet. It was already declining, but that major impact on that particular region, which was disproportionately reliant in its funding on, I think it was somewhere around 40%, but Alia, you can, I think 40% of the sort of donor funding, ODA, was from USAID or...
It depends on the region.
No, but I mean in Swana, or you mean even within the region?
It's a bit
complicated because even in Europe, I was very surprised to know that there was. So it depends on where you're sitting.
Yeah, but I mean in sort of media.
In the independent media, I heard the number 90%.
Right.
But I think it's not reliable.
Okay. But nonetheless, a significant portion was, so what that meant was the momentum that there was to explore the establishment of a regional fund, and it was stalled. But some of the principles by which you're saying, was there sort of, I'd say two things. One, that it is what we were told and what different actors told us was it's quite difficult to move money within the region. And also because of currency fluctuations and so on. And as you just said, related to your court cases, currency can go up and go down, and it has different effects. So there are things like that when you're dealing with money. We don't want to go too deep into those weeds, but that there were some affordances in how you design a financial structure in a region that help you sort of anchor a bit of stability with money. If you hold money at the regional level and it's kept in, for example, Switzerland. If the source capital is in Switzerland, you transfer it into the region and then you're able to fund within the region.
sort of more stably. That's one dynamic. But the other thing is that actually, and this is going back to what I was saying before, is that you need multiple tracks. You know, in most regions, it's no longer viable, and you know, the Trump administration has shown this, that you can attack vehicles and you can capture vehicles and you can disrupt them through multiple routes. And we know that this has happened in many, many societies, but now the US is finding it, and everyone is catching a cold off the back of it. But you need multiple tracks, and they need to be insulated from each other. So you don't have a single point of failure in your system. If one source of funding is compromised, then you have other sources you can go to. If one form of sort of R&D support is compromised, then another one is available. If one investor is pulled into a particular kind of legal case, then there are others that you can turn to. So you need to build redundancy into the system. And for many, many years, I think that there has been an over-focus within funding, and this is partly due to scarcity and a desire to be able to spread funds equitably and more, you know, in a wider range of places, to sort of not have duplication. I think when you don't have duplication, you don't have redundancy, right? It means that in your system, you're spreading your resources incredibly thin, and you're giving the sort of, in a sense, bare minimum to everybody, or a large number of people. And one of the challenges is that actually you need organizations to be able to be resilient to shock. And the shocks are becoming more and more frequent and more targeted, and more sort of multifaceted, the shocks. They can come from lots of different angles. And so when you're operating in a world where, for example, the first time I ever went to Perugia, I was invited to be on a panel, and it was talking about what is independence for independent media. What do we define by independence? And I said, well, and this was around the time that Julian Assange had been picked up for using, I think, MasterCard. I think MasterCard had shut off services to WikiLeaks. And I said, that's where independence is going. It's the technical stack, all your providers, every different other area. You're only as independent as the weakest link in that chain. So if you think independence is the old model of the printing press, we control the means of production and we can distribute. That's not independence. Independence is your email, your cloud provider, your payment processor, you know, any different aspect of your technical stack or your personal stack, or how, you know, individuals, you know. So I think these are the kinds of conditions that we're working with, and so I think funding needs to be able to address that as a holistic sense, in a holistic sense. And so that means that funding also needs to address things like as you were saying, the technology infrastructure. And there are funders who are dealing with that, but I think one of the things that is different about building dedicated journalism funding is that it looks at this as a package. And it's able to evolve over time to address needs, you know, without having to be pitched in the same way, right? You're not a sort of program within a foundation having to argue within the context of a bunch of different other programs, you know, we need more resources for this, or we're going to have to reprioritize because of that. Your entire institution, your fund, whether it's a local fund all the way up to a national or international fund, exists to support and sustain the journalism ecosystem through that lens. And so you're constantly thinking about all the different ways in which you are trying to support and sustain that, whether it is, you know, through collective management organizations, which are kind of popping up in different places to negotiate with, you know, you're getting grants to negotiate with the AI companies or the tech platforms as a collective industry, or you are being given money to develop sort of buildings, you know, like this one. You know, this came about because of philanthropic support, primarily, right? There are things that philanthropy can do to unlock and sort of remove barriers that stand in the way of journalism being self-standing, that journalism needs in order to develop technologically and needs in order to protect itself to fulfill the societal and democratic role that it has. And so I think those are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking in a much more holistic way. It's hard, it's tiring. Funders are also people, you know, and they have jobs and lives. And in many, I've sat and talked with funders who are working in societies where they are, the one breadwinner in their extended family. They're under enormous pressure as individuals and in the context of their institutions. But at the same time, I think that there's a really big imperative for us to embrace this more holistic view of how we fund, rather than what has been in the past quite, I think, a linear way of funding. And I think that is being manifested by many of these new institutions.
I'm very aware of time and know we have just over 10 minutes. I'm going to unfortunately cut Carolina off. We are planning to publish the full YouTube video online with Carolina, so please, we'll publish that after this talk. I'm going to fast forward to our final question before I open it out to the floor. I'm touching on Samir's point about being holistic, and I'm wondering whether, and this is for both of you, Ali and Samir, how future reservoirs of funding can be thought of not just as money flows, but as spaces for advocacy, particularly as we're fighting adversaries, external adversaries, big tech. Samir, can you just give some very brief examples of successful case studies where there's been kind of this extension of bargaining with big tech? I'm thinking maybe South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of funds, there's, South Africa, I'll condense massively, essentially big tech money, Google, towards the journalism industry. I think it's IAP, is that right? IAP, Independent Association of Publishers, yeah, was chosen as the conduit through which this funding would flow. And one of the interesting things is, in most cases, you've got, Google sets the terms of funding. The big tech organization that is sort of proposing to provide this funding tends to say, well, we want sign off on what that funding structure and vehicle looks like. In this case, because it was a negotiation between the IAP, Google, and in part IFPIM actually, as a sort of independent party and as a part funder of the process, it rebalanced the power and the discussion. So it is a genuinely independently designed fund in a way that maybe some of the other big tech funds have not been. So I think there are examples like that where when philanthropy or funding organizations that act in the interests of journalism, that act in the public interest, that have a democratic mandate of a sort, partly because they're regulated and all that kind of stuff, they have the ability to act as a counterweight to extreme power, like governments or like tech companies, who do want to give money into the space. I think that also holds for other kinds of corporates. There are other kinds of corporates that want to put money into the journalism and information sphere. That I think one of the roles that philanthropy can play is to help insulate and buffer to ensure that any outcomes, funds that are created in the interests of the industry, with the journalism industry's interests at heart and the public interest at the heart, not bounded by what a corporation or a government believes it should be the outcome.
Alia, do you want to final thoughts on kind of a commercial view of advocacy?
Well, yeah, from where I'm sitting, and I can relate with a lot of what Samir was saying, but given, I see, you used reservoirs of hope, and I know firsthand that hope alone, as amazing as it is, does not take you far without the infrastructure. I personally am seeing a great value. If I see my version of hope today is in building coalitions, building communities, that eventually, if I unlock my imagination, we're not small. We're just fragmented and siloed and all over, like in a lot of places under a lot of pressure. But we're not on the margins of societies. In my own reality, we had to be radical in what we were creating in terms of our journalism, because there was nothing to look at. There was not even a role model to look at. We really had to create it from scratch. So for a lot of people, when I look at my audience today, not everyone in my audience is willing to go to prison. Not everybody wants to be an activist. But there is a huge amount of audiences we can engage to grow our community, and for that we need infrastructures. But once you do, if you do it properly, really this building we're in is one, if you look at the strategy we have for the coming 4 years, I spoke about short-term monetization revenue, medium and long-term, but in the medium and long term, once you have the community, then building places for those communities and monetizing them, because as you were saying, there is economies happening there. But for that, you need to start, we have to start believing that public interest doesn't have to be at public interest that is really what it is. It's public interest. It should be compatible with being sustainable, but we need to work on this. Another thing is that, and I feel a little bit guilty being where I am, because Daraj is now 10 years, and we brought with us also knowledge that was accumulated over 20 years. If the ecosystem has to hold all the components, it has to, and this is why when you're addressing philanthropies and donors, it's a bit complicated, because you need different kinds of support for different kind of players within the ecosystem. You need the core funding to get and really long-term core funding. If what allows the lack of stability within newsrooms, you cannot, if you're thinking about how you're going to pay your salaries at the end of the month, I had that only 1 year, last year, 2025, because of all the reasons that were mentioned. It was an incredible year, and physically felt like I'm driving at two very different speeds. It's like I have to think about the long term and the medium term, and I have to figure out how I'm going to pay salaries at the end of the month. I was the poorest person and had to think like I'm the richest person at the same time. And you can do that for a while, but it cannot be how you live as an institution. So that's a lot in a very short answer. But if there is anything that gives me hope, is that and again, I look at the global south, not only my own region. There is a lot. We know each other, as one very smart friend of mine said it. Now we exist. Not only we exist, but we know where to find each other. What we need is to build around that investment that is this ecosystem.
What you're saying makes me think about a couple of things that I know we're coming towards the end, but I spend a lot of time talking to funders and sort of resource holders of different kinds, but I also spend a lot of time talking to journalists and listening to journalists and the conditions under which they work. And this isn't unique to journalists, it's also there among civil society activists and digital rights activists and all kinds of different people, lawyers and so on. But I was at a conference convening in Thailand of Asian journalists, and this was 3 years ago. During that conference, I was due to give clinics to people. They said, okay, as part of us bringing you here, you're going to give some one-on-one clinics to different people, and you can give them business advice. I went, okay, fine. In each of those conversations, the person I was talking with broke down in tears, because it was in this period during which the coup had happened in Myanmar. Journalists, some of the sort of people in the space of the conference had been exiled, literally physically exiled, had to escape through the jungle and those sorts of things. So, you had journalists who had sort of done that and had reported along the way. They had lost everything. They were starting up from zero. They were recipients of charity and of support and kind of solidarity from others. But then you had others from across the region of Southeast Asia and Asia more generally who were so committed to what they were doing that they had sold their houses, or they were taking out loans, or they were running their outlet and paying their staff off the credit card, or whatever. So the amount of personal risk and personal debt and diminution of their own wealth that they were willing to do and go through in service of a public service mission, in the absence of there being, this was at a time when international funding was already in decline, right? So I think that then I gave a sort of workshop, much to a room like this, and sort of said, okay, who has used a credit card to subsidize their thing? And 60-70% of the people in the room put their hands up. And we went through a bunch of different questions like this, and I interspersed this with also questions from their donors about who's been asked about sustainability, who's been asked about diverse revenue streams, and all of these different things. And the mismatch between the two, to me, is a really, really signal failure in the system, because the subsidy that comes from the field, from the sharp edges of the field, from the people on the front line, and you've described one element, where in your organization you didn't know whether you could make payroll. I was in Nairobi, and journalists in Nairobi were without pay for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. The deputy president of the Association of Journalists, who was an on-screen news anchor, had defaulted on her rent and was couch surfing. If you can imagine, a major news anchor on TV, national TV, not being able to pay her own rent, having to live on somebody's couch. So, that's the level, that's the extent that this, we're talking about people who, in that context, in that financial context, are effectively subsidizing the ecosystem, subsidizing democracy, subsidizing public understanding in society after society after society. So we have to find collectively ways to think about how to resource this. And I think that is the next challenge to me. We're sort of talking about reservoirs of hope. There was a piece in Alliance a few months ago in which I was sort of interviewed, and I think it was Islands of Hope at that point. Now we've got reservoirs. And I think and I think we do need to keep pushing at these questions, but reminding ourselves of what the actual weight. And there are people in this room who will be in positions like that, or who will have to have a second job, or who, will be at the limit of what they can achieve financially. They're restrained from growth or whatever it might be because of the conditions of the funding environment. So we need to find ways of bringing other kinds of actors in, other social investors, or other kinds of financial actors. But I think the other thing that I think is we also need to think about the money differently. And I think if we can think in terms of how do we help the field itself develop assets, buildings like this could be owned by journalism. Could be owned by journalism organizations, right? They could be owned by, or have a share in. There are things like that I think that we need to be thinking about. How do we transfer assets into the sector so that the sector can also profit from those sorts of things? And then the last thing I'd say is, I know universal basic income is like, every single thing, despite the fact that it's been running for 20 years, every single universal basic income thing is an experiment, because nobody can quite accept that it's sort of going to happen and should be there. And it's been co-opted by big tech. But I think one of the ways in which we could think about this is, because it's a standing capacity within society, is how do we shift towards a way in which, and the Danes have done this in their own media industry, think about a system of structural subsidies that give a bedrock of support on a sort of unconditional basis. We're not forcing people to compete for grants, we're not forcing people to do this, but we find a way to support and sustain something that everyone says is important in the way that we do with health and other things. It's so intrinsic and so culturally important, so democratically important, and important for the overall health of the entire system, that I think that is, in a sense, where I think the hope comes from. I think if you can begin to have conversations like that renew, they're a bit like when health systems were reinvented and so on. That's the point of inflection that we're at, to me. And I think that philanthropy has an enormous role in cultivating and catalyzing that discussion. It isn't the pillar that is going to uphold that. It doesn't have the resource to do it. but it can catalyse that and bring people to the table in a way that we can leap over some of these barriers and begin to return to this, to the sector some of this subsidy that the people working in it have been giving.
Thank you so much. Inflection can feel very heavy, and thank you for humanising what is a moment of crises for all of us. And I think it's just important to hold that human, very human element to this topic. I know we've come to the end of our time. I want to just squeeze maybe one question in the room, and Zibran, if we have one question virtually, do we have any? No. Okay, one question in the room then. At the front. Do we have any microphones? Yes, one coming to you. Over there.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed listening to you. I'm an editorial advisory council member of Alliance and longtime contributor and a longtime funder, working in mostly spaces of youth and women and children. But I don't think it matters. What I keep hearing is actually the core funding is important, but it's not even enough. It's the infrastructure. It's the smart money that needs to come, not just the money itself. And what I'm starting to think after, I focus most of my work in Turkey, but I also work globally on a number of other initiatives. But what I'm seeing in Turkey specifically is, even though it's been 20 years, nonprofit organizations have a lot of trouble even spending that money, even figuring out how to spend it and then spending it, not to mention evaluating its impact. And I don't mean this to dishonor their efforts or their impact and so on. As you probably all know, it's not the easiest context to work in. But as funders, I've moved very far away from the idea that a grant is enough. I mean, I'm working now specifically 12 years with a foundation that allows me to coach and support each one of those organizations independently. And I realized that actually it's not the grant that's only helping. It's also working with them on, do you need Salesforce or some CRM system to track your participants? Or do you need to work with someone who knows about theory of change and SROI or something to measure your impact or communicate it so that you can reach more donors, or to build business sustainability models? So I feel like listening to you made me realize that it doesn't really matter the sector funders are funding in. We have reached a point where we all agree core funding is important, but as funders, have we reached also the agreement that our ways of working need to change so that as funders, we have the time to work independently with each of our grantees and bring in other forms of expertise that we don't have that might also help. That's in a non-financial way. I'm curious to hear your reactions. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. It's not an either or, because without the core funding, you don't have anything to build the infrastructure for.
It's just not enough.
But I'll tell you from our own experience, because we're not a small, like Daraj is relatively a bigger newsroom, was founded by older, we're dinosaurs compared to the younger organizations we work with. We work with a number of smaller organizations, some of which are Arabs, but based in Turkey, in Jordan, in Yemen, etc. Anything that is infrastructure, like getting journalists paid in Yemen, is a disaster. But we have figured out a way because we were a bigger organization. Now, what you're saying is, it's true. This is why when I say building coalitions and building alliances makes a difference. For us, Syria, for example, right now, we're not Syrians, we're Lebanese based in Beirut, but 30% of our newsroom is Syrian. And the biggest audience we have is Syrian. And we work with 5 or 6 smaller Syrian organizations. We handle their fundraising, we write their narrative reports, we do their accounting. It's not, for us, it's very important because they have amazing journalists that we cannot pay amazing salaries. What we can do is we have an admin team that is developed enough to take care of that. Now, can we scale this? No. This is, again, we reach our limit as the bigger organization in order, and we have to fundraise for everybody and depend largely on grants because the monetary value that we could have is not doable without the scale. So this is the difference. We created something now we call the network of networks, which is looking, we have 650 journalists who are really, I can say, some of the best in our language. If we pay them the minimum salary to keep them on board just for that, we're going to eventually lose them when they become, they also are mid-career and have to think about their own sustainability. So this is why I'm saying but imagine if the core funding stops to build the infrastructure. You would be left with nothing to actually use on that infrastructure. What I'm saying is that this needs to stay, and also I think I fully agree on the idea that duplication is required, because this is how you do risk management. But at the same time, it requires a bigger common strategy. I'm a big fan of strategies. If you have, like, some of these conversations are so important to make sure we're not duplicating. And I give, again, very fast example. In Lebanon, if we did the journalism and the advocacy groups and the accountability groups did not work on it, there would not have been a legal follow-up. The legal follow-up happened, and our central bank governor is being prosecuted in 7 countries because another organization picked up our work. So this fragmentation within civil society, I think this is when I say we're all working on quicksands. Let's level the ground and build on solid, stable ground so we can have better impact. But it cannot be either or.
I'm a big fan, is probably not the word, but I really like the Mariana Mazzucato approach, mission-based thinking, and I think that approach, which is essentially the same thing as what the New Deal, so Roosevelt's New Deal was, you build a framework that is sort of unarguable for everybody, and they all find their place within it, and I think that, there hasn't really been a sort of mission-based approach to information and communication and media. We've never really had that, partly because, in a way, some of it is coming bottom up through these structured funds for part of the sector. And it's coming through things like, this collective management organization in Indonesia, which is a really amazing example, I think, which was also partly informed by what's happening in Denmark. And, so you've got these sort of peer-to-peer things going on where people are finding the bigger frameworks within which they can reasonably work and practically make something happen. But I think that collective sense of what is this all for? We all believe, broadly speaking, in the same things. And, the big commercials say they believe in public interest journalism. The small, organizations exist almost purely to do that. There is a common interest and a common ground between them. And increasingly, the adversaries are clearer and clearer, right? So I think that's, now is the time for us to try and think in that broader frame. In the past, we've been encouraged to be competitive. This industry is a highly competitive one. It's compete for eyeballs, compete for advertising, compete for funding. I think the only way that common sort of, the only way we're going to solidify the quicksand, if you like, is by collective endeavor. And I would put it bluntly, some suppression of ego. Institutional ego, sometimes it's personal ego, but it's an industry that has, needed ego. You need ego. You need sometimes kind of quasi-heroic behavior, or psychopathic behavior maybe sometimes, but it is one that is, it rewards intrepid, tireless, fearless work, and sometimes that has come at the cost of collaboration. And so I think one of the things that needs to be thought through is what is that bigger frame that we all fit into and that we all can contribute to, even if it, whether it's 1% of what we do or 100% of what we do. And so that, I think, is where, to me, these kinds of conversations help hopefully push forward some of that potential. It gives permission for people to say, well, okay, what if we did give up a bit of ego here? What if, one last example I'll give, it's one isolated example, right? Everything is anecdata. But there was a journalism organization in the northeast of Brazil. This is prior to the fund that Carolina runs being instituted. They received a grant from an international foundation. And that foundation actually told me about this independently of the outlet. But the outlet received a grant But then in the contractual negotiation of the grant said, listen, there are a bunch of other smaller organisations in our area. We are aware that they don't know how to talk to donors. We're aware that they're afraid to talk to donors. When they go to conferences, they're sort of terrified of talking to the programme officer because there's just power dynamic. They don't know how to do it. So can we use a third of our grant to give them money? And the donor was like, oh, okay, that's interesting, sure, go ahead. And so that then began this process of one, I forget if it was third or a half, I can't remember, but, acts like that where somebody will, suppress their ego, they will reduce their own institutional benefit in order to benefit the ecosystem around them, without which they won't be as strong, rising tide, all of that kind of stuff. I think that is a really interesting signal. So I think those sorts of things happening within the ecosystem are when you talk about reservoirs of hope or whatever it is, I think that is the kind of stuff that you can build on, you can extrapolate that, you can scale that kind of behavior, and that changes ecosystems eventually if enough people are doing it. If that's a behaviour that, I was on the board of a foundation that would give what was called a +1 grant. So every grantee was invited to nominate a second grantee from their wider ecosystem who had not received a grant from us before. And then they received, I forget what the exact percentage was, like a 10% of the value of their grant. But, things like that I think incentivize behaviours that are about collective awareness, situational awareness. Who is excluded? Who would you like to bring forward? Who would you like to bring in? Who do you think should be on the radar of the sector? So, those kinds of things I think help us see, help a busy philanthropic sector see more clearly and see more broadly, and help people who are not normally within its orbit to be brought in to then subtly and slowly change the balance, right? And see collective benefit.
And part of these conversations we're having is not just to swap notes, but to build coalitions. And I think that's where we're in that era now. And hopefully this session continues with many conversations outside after this. We're deep into extra time, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for attending live stream and both here in person. Please do say hello, and I just want to thank, as I'm wrapping up, I want to thank my team at Alliance Magazine. We're all here in Berlin, but they've done some amazing work getting this event sorted. So thank you to my colleagues, and thank you Samir and Alia and Carolina, if she's somewhere in a hospital ward right now. Thank you all so much.
Thank
It's
you.
been a pleasure. Thank you.
It happened.
Me and Smith hate each other, actually.
But you can stay. Was you happy with it?
Yeah, I mean,
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say that, if you and I could sit on the same stage and have a civil conversation,
Anyone
not mention
can do that.
then almost anyone.
all this talk about competition coalitions would actually...
For public interest.
Yeah.
For public interest. Thank you. And it's nice to meet you.